It was before dawn when the wolf came to him, white as new snow and silent as winter. The fires of the camp dwindled to ashen eyes. The men slept in little worlds of breath and blanket, dreams stitched to the ground by frost. Jon Snow stood alone with the god's dark sky above him and Winterfell's black shape crouched on the horizon like a memory he dared not touch. He looked down as Ghost brushed his hip and lifted his great head, milk-pale fur catching the faintest smear of starlight. The wolf's eyes were red coals banked under ice. Jon set his palm to the broad skull and felt the power in it, a river under stone. "You always find me," he said, voice a mist in the bitter air. Ghost pressed closer, and the old ache eased. The one that had started the night they took his father's head and had only deepened since. He closed his hand in the ruff of fur at the wolf's neck. The beast stood higher than any hound and broader in the shoulder than most rangy destriers. Ghost had grown while Jon was dying, it seemed. The months beyond the wall and in the shadow of the pink flayed man had put a winter into him, long and hard. Jon let his breathing slow until it matched the wolf's, the rise and fall, the hush between. Somewhere in that silence, something beyond the camp's ugly smells of old stew and horse leather and fear, he felt the weirwoods watching. Not with eyes but with the willow-threaded patience of things that had seen kings come and go the way storms do. A footfall behind him. He didn't turn. He knew Sansa's step now as he would know snowfall starting, soft and inexorable. She came to his side in a dark cloak furred at the collar, her hair gathered back with a bit of leather as practical as any soldier's tie. She'd refused a lady's colors and wore no sigil but the wolf stitched on the cloak's breast. The moon made her pale. The cold made her sharp. She did not look at him at first. She looked at Ghost, and a ghost of a smile touched the corner of her mouth before it fled. "Do you ever sleep?" she asked. "Not tonight." He rubbed Ghost's ear and the wolf made a deep chuffing sound that could have been contentment or warning. "You'll need your strength." "I'll need my wits," he said. "Strength won't help against Ramsay if I let him choose the ground here." His breath was thin and angry. He stilled himself. "You've told me as much." She turned then. In her face he saw Winterfell as it would be if it knew itself again. Discipline and kindness under snow-laden boughs. Her eyes were the lake in the God's Wood the morning after a storm. Cold, clear, reflecting the truth of whatever stood before it. "Then do not let him choose your heart either," she said. "He will try to pull it out of your chest and make you follow it." Jon thought of a boy with shaggy brown hair and eyes like hearthstones, too warm for detention, too quick to run. He swallowed, and for a moment the cold cut him clean open. "If he brings Rickon," Jon said, "I'll not stand still." Sansa drew in a breath. It seemed to hurt her, and for an instant he hated himself for making her do it. "Then do not go alone," she said after that swallow of ice. "You have Ghost. Use him." The idea had been haunting him since the first time Ghost slipped ahead of his thoughts and showed him a rabbit track under a crust of snow. Since the first time he let his mind lean into the wolf's and found another world where scent was law and distance bent. It was madness and memory both. He had never straddled Ghost's back as a man might a horse. He had never needed to. But Ghost was not a horse. Ghost was an old tale made flesh. There were stories in the gift of the first men, of skin changers who rode bears and wolves as freely as wearing a second coat. Orell had done worse, in a crueler way, and Jon had killed him for it. He flinched at the thought as if it had teeth. Sansa must have read the flicker in his face. "You are not him," she said. He nodded. "I know. I wrote letters," she said then. So quiet the words did not seem to make a sound. "I wrote them weeks ago. I would have told you if I had been sure." Jon studied her. The camp's darkness pressed close, but in that pocket of quiet by the dying fire their breath made a private world. "To whom?" he asked, though some part of him had known all along. "To those who owe us," she said. "To those who want to. I cannot promise they will come. But we cannot fight this with your sword and a handful of spears alone. Hope is a blade too, if you know how to use it without cutting yourself." He let that sit between them. The old Jon, the one who'd thought honor a road you could follow like a causeway across a marsh, would have demanded answers, pressed her until he had names and times and guarantees. The new John, who had died and clawed his way back through a black sea to air, considered what it would mean to bind his plan to other men's promises. Sansa's gaze did not waver. She had been a child once, and it had nearly killed her. He had been a boy, and it had killed him. They were neither now. "If they come," he said at last, "they come unseen. Ramsay can count spears. I want him to think we are fewer than we are." "He always thinks others are less than he is," Sansa said. Her mouth twisted. "It is how he dies." They stood with that thought until the cold began to gnaw at his fingers. "Go sleep," he told her. "I can't." She put her gloved hand on his forearm. "You can," she said, and the command in her voice was almost gentle. "You must. Try." He watched her go until she was little more than a darker shadow in the dark. Then he dropped to one knee and pressed his brow to Ghost's. A smell came up, iron and old blood and a sweetness like crushed pine needles. He let it in. He let the wolf look back at him from inside the wolf, the room behind the eyes. When he rose, he did not seek his tent. He sought Tormund Giantsbane by the glow of laughter. The wildlings had roasted something thin and stringy and torn as a bannerman's flag. They were telling stories of giants who had thrown down the walls of castles with stones the size of longboats, and of a woman with teeth like knives who had bitten the moon. Tormund's beard held sparks. He clapped Jon on the back with a hand that would have staved in the ribs of a lesser friend. "You look like someone who's about to set fire to his own beard," Tormund said, squinting at Ghost. "Or ride a wolf." "Both," Jon said. "I need leather, a harness, not a saddle, something that won't slip. And I need it before dawn." Tormund's laugh came out like a stone rolling down a mountain. "You hear that, lads? The kneeler would be a wildling after all." He sobered, eyes keen. "You sure?" He gave Ghost a long glance. "He's no pony." "He's more than a pony," Jon said. "I won't bind him with a bit or a girth. Just a loop I can hold when he leaps. If he lets me." "You've ridden stranger things," Tormund said, remembering the dead wind on the wall and the vertigo of the climb. He tore a length of greasy leather from a bag and beckoned. "We'll make you a loop that'll hold you to your death. Then, if you fall, try to fall on someone you don't like." They worked by the low fire spit. Tormund's fingers were surprisingly sure at such close work. He braided strips of oiled leather into a broad band that would sit at the base of Ghost's neck, high enough not to choke, low enough to catch under his shoulder blades. He set 2 loops for Jon to grip, one left, one right, and a third that hung like a pommel. Jon ran his hands over the leather. It would not cut Ghost. The inside was padded with furs cut from a ruined jerkin. He said as much. "Your lady cousin steward donated that jerkin," Tormund said, baring teeth. "He'll be honored." Jon brought the harness to Ghost. The dire wolf watched him and did not move when Jon slid the band around his chest, when he fitted it and pulled it snug. Ghost's ears twitched once when Jon lifted the loop strap, and then the wolf's great tail moved once, like the flick of a banner toward home. Jon let out a breath he had not known he held. He put weight on Ghost's shoulder and leaned in. The wolf tolerated it, then shifted, balancing them both. "Knight's nearly nibbled to the bone," Tormund said. "Try him." Jon stepped into the harness's stirless hold and swung a leg over the wolf's back. Ghost's spine was nothing like a horse's. It flexed fluidly, muscles rippling under his thighs. He took a fistful of fur at the withers and the leather loop in the other hand. He pressed his knees in, not to command but to cling, and Ghost surged like a winter river breaking out of ice. They moved. The earth rose and fell. Jon's body found a rhythm, and when he thought he would be thrown, the wolf turned, and his mind turned with him. For a moment Jon's vision doubled. He saw the camp from a few feet higher, men as lumps with breath pluming, fires as red eyes. And he smelled it. Old ash, old fear, the musk of damp wool and salted meat, the clean bite of snow. Beyond that, the thick stench of Winterfell's kitchens. Beyond that, the hot copper of the kennels. Rage lit up Ghost's blood. Jon trembled and gentled him with a wordless thought. a drag of hand along a known path, a name that was more a shape than a sound. Ghost slowed and sat. John slid down, knees watery. "If I had a horn," Tormund said, "I'd blow it for you myself." John managed a smile and then went to look for Davos Seaworth, who would be at the edge of the camp where the old and the honest go to make peace with dawn. He found him walking alone under a sky thinning toward iron, his cloak pulled tight, the knuckles of his hands raw with weather and penance. The Onion Knight nodded at Ghost with the wary respect of a sailor sighting a whitecap. "Couldn't sleep, M-Lord?" Davos said. "John," he corrected automatically. "John?" Davos allowed, and something like warmth moved in the lines of his face. "There is a place I mean to see, a little rise yonder where Stannis made his last camp. I would go alone." "You're not a knight born to be safe anywhere," John said. "No," Davos said, "but I have walked out of worse gods' nights than this, and if they want me now, they can carry me. I'll be back by light." He began to go, then paused. "If you mean to do mad things today," he added dryly, "do them well." John wanted to tell him about Ghost. He did not. He watched Davos shrink to a dark stitch on the pale land and then vanish in a fold of it. The camp stirred behind him, a beast waking. Men rose with the groans of old wood. Armor clinked like cutlery in a chest. Someone cried for more oats. Someone prayed. The Red Woman stood by the fire with her hair like a spill of rubies and her eyes like a hearth that had forgotten who warmed herself there. She looked at John as if she'd heard everything he had not said. "If I fall," he told her, because the words lodged in him and needed out. "Do not bring me back." Her smile was smaller than a knife. "I do not command the Lord of Light," she said. "If he wants you, he will have you. And if he doesn't, then you go where men go." Her face softened unexpectedly. "Do what you can while you are burning. That is all any of us do." She looked at Ghost. "The old powers love their own. Be kind to them and they will gnaw your enemies' bones." He thought of bones and of the man who had covered Winterfell with flayed skins like banners. "I will be kind to nothing that looks like him," John said, and left her with the fire. By mid-morning, the armies arrayed themselves on the field before Winterfell, two lines like stitches across a wound that was about to open. Ramsay Bolton's banners were obscene against the pale sky. Men hung upside down in pink profiles that made a mockery of blood. Behind those banners rose the pike forest and the disciplined shields of men who had learned to live by a tyrant's will. On the other side stood John's line. Wildlings in furs and piecemeal mail, the spears of a few northern houses, women from Bear Island with eyes like the far shore of a frozen lake, archers with old scars, one giant whose shadow lay long as a god's. One shifted and snorted, steam wreathing his face. Sansa sat a little back of the line with the standard bearers and the spare mounts. She wore mail and leather under her cloak, light enough to run in, heavy enough to stop a blade if the day felt kind. She caught John's gaze once. He nodded. She did not nod back. She saved the motion for when it mattered. But her mouth firmed. Ramsay rode out of his line with horsehair plumes and a smile he'd learned in a mirror. Beside him rode a man bearing a single burden. John's stomach went to stone. The boy's wrists were bound before him, his hair tangled, his face hollow with hunger and hope. He had grown so much in their years apart that John's mind, treacherous as weather, tried to make him into another boy entirely. But then Rickon looked up from under the hair and John saw Bran, and he saw Robb, and he saw little Arya running wild down a hall, and it was Rickon after all. Rickon collapsed into too many ghosts. Ramsay halted at the midpoint between the armies and the man with the burden dismounted roughly, hauling Rickon down. John rode out to meet them not on a horse but with Ghost at his knee. The line rustled behind him like grass. He could feel Tormund's stare on his back, Sansa's held breath, Davos's silence. He could feel Ghost's muscles coiled against his calf. "Brother?" Rickon croaked, and some on both sides flinched. The word broke this field open more than a horn. Ramsay smiled as if it were his name. "A family reunion," he said. "I knew the North could still put on a show." He patted Rickon's head as one might soothe a dog before drowning it. "Run to your brother, boy," he said. "Run fast." He sliced the bonds with a small knife as delicate as any lady's bodkin. He shoved Rickon in the back. "Run. Don't," Sansa whispered across half a field. Jon felt the whisper at the base of his skull and felt, too late, that the whisper had been a warning he had no hope of heeding. Rickon ran because boys run, for games, for food, for life. He ran straight out as if a line could save him. Ramsay drew a bow and knocked an arrow. Jon saw the angle and the easy cruelty in the man's wrist and moved before thought. He sank a hand into Ghost's harness loop and spoke the wolf's name in his chest. And Ghost leapt. The world narrowed to speed. Snow scud under Ghost's heavy paws. Ertor. The ground came at them and then fled. Jon tried to shout to Rickon to swerve, to cut left, cut right, lay down, do anything but make himself a string to be plucked. The wind took the words. He put his knees to Ghost's ribs and Ghost flowed, eating distance. The first arrow struck dirt yards short in a puff of white. The second whispered past Jon's shoulder, cold and precise. The third came from a different place than Jon's human mind would have guessed. Ramsay had shifted a step. Cheating. Jon felt the shot in the wolf before he saw it. Zig, he thought, wordless. And Ghost swerved as if he had invented the idea, body bending like water around a stone. Rickon's mouth was open. He was making noise, but Jon could not hear it over air and blood. They were close enough now that Jon saw how much taller Rickon had gotten, how much more Winterfell his shoulders tried to remember. He reached. The fourth arrow found the boy. It hit with the soft, terrible sound an arrow makes in meat. Rickon stumbled in a spray of red that was too bright against snow and fell almost into Jon's outstretched hand. Ghost braked so fast the earth came up in clods under his claws. Jon slid from the wolf with a strange certainty, as if he had done this before in a world where it had turned out differently. He lifted Rickon. The boy's lips moved. The breath that carried the movement smelled like a winter cellar and old apples, like words stored a long time. "Home," Rickon said, but only Jon heard. The arrow's fletching was black against his tunic. Jon's hands shook. He wanted to pull the shaft and could not. He wanted to press his mouth to Rickon's hair and did. Ghost leaned over them and made a sound that was not a sound at all but the world narrowing to a needle. He laid the boy down slowly, as if the ground would hurt him more than the arrow. When he stood again, the field had changed. He did not understand how there could be more air when there was no breath left anywhere. He looked at Ramsay. He saw not a man but a thing in a man's skin. He saw not a smile but a cut. He stepped back into Ghost's harness and placed his hands in the loops. He did not shout. He did not give any signal the human way. He put his heels to the wolf and sent the thought like a thrown knife. They charged. Not a foolish, solitary rush like a man who has mistaken his grief for a war, but an arc low and feral with a sliver of reason in it. Ghost ran not straight but with the angles of a hunter. He closed with Ramsay's skirmishers at a slant and hit them like winter falling through a roof. Men and horses flinched. Ghost's jaws took a rider's leg at the knee and peeled him from the saddle. Jon's sword took another as he came out of his seat, Longclaw bright in a world that had gone pale. The wolf's weight smashed into a shield line that still thought itself safe behind rank and file. Ghost did not stop. He leapt and twisted and landed inside men's fear. The Bolton's archers lifted as one as they had been drilled to do. But the first volley was hesitant, horses in the path, friends in the spill. The arrows that flew bit two wildlings who had followed too far, and an old spear thane from a forgotten house whose name would be remembered now only in a girl's grief. Ghost turned out of the killing rain with an instinct that was partly his and partly the echo of Jon's skin and bones. They skated along the edge of that iron hail and came away with it whispering past Jon's shoulder and humming in Ghost's fur. Ramsay's face had changed. Just a little, just enough for the pure pleasure to flicker. He knocked again, calm as if he were shooting a goose on a summer bank. Jon leaned forward and the wolf went forward, and for a heartbeat the whole field belonged to that triangle of predator and prey and man's brutality. Then the cavalry went. Trumpets called. The Bolton horse thundered, level and black as rain coming across a moor. The wildlings shouted, and their shout sounded older than horns. John did not remember deciding to live. He tightened his hands and held. Ghost angled toward the right where Tormund's flank stood lighter. They would not meet the full force head-on. They would cut into it and make it bleed sideways. Tormund saw and understood. He bared his teeth and crashed forward with the free folk, axes raised, the big men in furs screaming as if they'd been born out of ice. What followed was hours condensed to the space between heartbeats. Ghost darted through the melee, too low for lances, too fast for bored warhorses who had never been asked to fight a myth. He snapped at hamstrings and brought mounts down in a chaos of legs. John reached left and right, carving where Ghost gave him openings. Blood misted his face, warm, and then in the next breath freezing. He lost count of men. He learned the feel of bone through leather and the sound a man makes when he dies thinking of nothing so much as whether he left a gate unlatched. Sometimes he could smell Ramsay's scent. Almonds and fat and something he recognized as the coppery sour of satisfied cruelty, on a wind that came from somewhere else, and every time it made Ghost's hackles climb like sunrise along his spine. That scent made John's throat fill with brine. He swallowed it down and cut at a man who had gotten inside Ghost's turn. He saw Tormund take a spear on the shoulder and spin and shove it through the gut of the man who had thrust it, bellowing crimson in his beard. He saw one lift a horse with his hands, toss it aside as a boy tosses a stick, and reach for 3 more men, and arrows sprouted from him like black reeds. Then the pikes came. From behind the Bolton line, men moved with the slow horror of a tide, shields overlapping, spears like a forest shutting out light. They advanced with no passion, only practice. They pressed John's army in, step by step, with that ruthless patience tyrants love. The wildling charge buckled. The horses wheeled away, and Ramsay's line closed like a hand making a fist. This was what they had planned, John thought with a terrible clarity. This was the trap inside the grief. He looked for an angle out and found none. Corpses made mounds. The living began to be turned into walls. Men died standing because there was no room to fall. The air went bad, wet, and thick. John tasted earth and iron and the bitter fug of fear. Up, he breathed to Ghost. But there was nowhere to go that wasn't sharpened to kill. The pikes bristled 3 ranks deep. The wolf's lips peeled back, and he made himself thin as winter's last fox and slid between 2 spears and bit the man holding one of them through his glove so hard that blood shot. John hauled hard on the loop, just enough to clear the next thrust. He felt the spear catch his mail, a plucked string along his spine. He felt men behind him press in and press in. He couldn't lift his arms. He couldn't lift his lungs. He thought of the cold black where he had been, once when the world forgot him. Then one roared. It rolled across the field like thunder from a sky that had been clear a moment ago. The giant reached for the pikes and snapped them like dry twigs. He wrenched shields with one hand and shook men from behind them. The wall stumbled. John pushed with Ghost into the stumble, finding fissures where moments before there had been none. Tormund found one too and drove an axe blade into it, and a path yawned like a mouth. Now, John said, and meant it not just for the wolf. He meant it for the day. Ghost leapt the fallen shields and landed atop 3 men, his weight crushing, his mouth opening on a throat. John's sword rose and fell. It might still have ended there in a slow grind of blood and breathlessness. The North's remnants smothered under a machine that had learned its lessons too well. Hope thins at the same pace air does. But there are other lessons in the North that do not show on parade. Sansa sat her spare mount a short distance back where she could see without being seen and waited without shaking. Her hands were so cold on the reins she thought her knuckles might break and spill ice. She watched the pikes and the shrinking, shuddering knot of men she loved inside that steel sea. She had done what she could when men counted. Now she did what women do when counting ends. A small sound reached her. First the wind playing with a ribbon, then a tom's per made of iron, then the murmur of many hoofs. She didn't turn at once. She didn't need to. She had always been good at hearing the room. But when she did look, she saw the line crest the distant rise in a long wave of sunlight striking on polished armor, and the cold in her hands broke at last and went somewhere else. The Knights of the Vale came down the slope in ordered rows, lances like a field of wheat scythed all at once. At their head rode Peter Baelish with Deception's small smile, and Lord Yon Royce with his old honor burning stern as a hearth in a storm. The banners of the falcon lifted in the pale light and tilted, and then there was no more room for hope to doubt itself. They struck the Bolton's rear like a hammer. The pike square broke. The men who had been pressing forward found themselves pressed from behind. They tried to wheel, but a machine that loves itself slow does not pivot quick. Horses went through them the way a thaw goes through river ice, cracking what had thought itself permanent. Men fell and disappeared under hooves, under boots, under the terrible necessity of the day. John felt the change and did not ask what had brought it. He set his heels and Ghost answered. They cut and cut. Tormund laughed the laugh of a man who has just been told his son will live. One ripped a standard from its pole and used the pole to sweep 3 men into the air like dandelions. Davos found a hole and led men through it with the shrugged-off fatigue of a sailor who has turned a belt into a rope more times than coins can count. Ramsay's line melted like fat in a hot pan, and the stench of it filled the field. John saw the man himself with a small knot of guards, pulling away. He did not think. He reached into Ghost and let the wolf's senses hook him like meat. Ramsay was a taste in the air. He was a heat signature in a place that had gone cold. Ghost tracked him the way a grievance tracks a life. Unerring, merciless. They ran. They left the hectoring metal world at their backs and ran. The battlefield thudded away behind them, and Winterfell swelled until it was all again, the whole problem and the whole answer. Ramsay's men spurred the gateward horses and blew the horn and poured into the open mouth of their false home. John saw the portcullis begin its slow drop like a jaw with a speech impediment closing on a word. One barrel toward it with the inevitability of a landslide. The grill came down across his chest and bit. He roared again, bracing against stone, blood running in, around, over the iron teeth. He heaved. The metal screamed. John felt the sound in his molars. Ghost flew under the half-fallen portcullis in a burst of red and white. John flattened to the wolf's back, the top of his head scraping rust. They were inside. The yard of Winterfell spread around them with its clean, bright cruelty. No snow fell within those walls tonight. It was all cut stone and trampled sleet, breath condensing and hanging like ghosts. Ramsay turned in his saddle and loosed an arrow at the big white blur. It was a good shot even in fear. Ghost pivoted in mid-stride, and the arrow grazed his shoulder, leaving a streak the color of berries. John felt it like someone had drawn a hot finger down his own skin. He hauled on the right loop, too fierce, and Ghost snarled. Not at Ramsay, but at him. John heard the rebuke and softened his hand. Ramsay smiled again like he'd remembered who he was. He fitted another arrow. John slid off the wolf and took up a dropped shield from the yard. A flayed man's device leered up at him from the paint. He lifted it between himself and Winterfell's bastard. The arrow struck the shield with a thock that numbed his arm to the elbow. He began to walk forward. Ramsay's second shot hit a little high. He stepped closer. The third arrow opened a new ache on his shoulder where there were no old aches left to cover it. Ghost paced on his left, low and ready, bleeding slowly, eyes never leaving the man with the bow. "Let's end a story," John said hoarsely, to the yard, to the gods, to the boy lying back on the field under a sky that hadn't cared what it saw. Ramsay discarded the bow and drew a sword. It was a pretty thing, cruel and narrow like its owner's good suits. He wore it as a man wears a smile he has bought. John did not bother to remember the sword's name. Longclaw had a name because it had known hands worthy of one. He slid his own blade from the scabbard and moved. He did not fight pretty. He fought like a man whose body had learned too much about dying and now intended to learn more about the alternative. Ramsay had speed and the daring of a man who has never bled properly. John had weight and the stubborn grace of a smith who has made one thing too many to fear breaking something else. He closed and bound and battered aside, the shield doing rough work. Ghost lunged when Ramsay's attention flicked where it must not, dragging one of the man's guards off his feet and turning his scream into something short. John pushed. He hit Ramsay, shield to chest. and rode him to the ground in the churned snow of his own yard. Jon's fists found the man's face through the shield's rim. He did not count. Numbers had left him somewhere on the field with his brother. He hit until the day made a noise somewhere else and asked him to stop. Ghost stood just beyond his shoulder, breathing hard, watching Ramsay as if deciding which part mattered least. It was Sansa who pulled Jon gently back from that place. She did not touch him. She said his name as she had said it in the dark, a command disguised as an invitation. He looked up at her. Her face was not calm. There were weather systems moving in it that would last a long time. But her eyes were clear as ever. She looked at Ramsay, and her mouth thinned. "Alive?" she said to Jon, though it hurt. "He must be alive." Jon understood. He did not ask why. He stood and left the man lying in the yard where dogs had once come and gone at his pleasure. He wiped his face and could not tell if it was all blood. One staggered into the yard through a ruin that had once been a gate. He was more arrows than skin now. He dropped to one knee with the tired sound a mountain might make when it finally sits down. Men ran to him and then stopped, unsure of what to do in the presence of something that had already died standing and now meant to do it again. The giant looked at Jon and at Ghost, and for a moment some memory moved in his big dark eye. The sight of a boy and a wolf on a frozen lake, a shared breath, a world that was not this. Then he groaned and fell forward, the ground shaking as if the gods had clapped their hands once. The yard was very quiet after that. The dead had to find their places. The living had to remember what names were. They locked Ramsay below, where the air smelled old and wet. Sansa went down alone later, while the evening's pale wash came and went on the yard stones above. Jon did not ask her what she did. She returned with her mouth set and the light gone ruby at its edge, as if the color had soaked up from blood and stayed. When he looked at her, there were questions, but none that would make anything different. She lifted her chin a fraction. It was enough. That night, Winterfell's halls were close with smoke and laughter that sounded incredulous, like men telling jokes at the foot of a gallows that had snapped. The kitchens never slept. The gods would, being older than all of this and indifferent, drank their noise and gave back the sound of slow water under ice. Jon went there because he could not bear walls yet. Ghost slid through the snow at his side, a pale current, his wound washed clean and bound with a strip of someone's cloak. The heart tree watched them with its red leaves like old hands. Jon went down on a knee and pressed his fist to the frozen ground. He did not know how to pray anymore. He had used up that language and needed a new one. The heart tree listened anyway. Perhaps it did not care what words he used. Perhaps it recognized something that had nothing to do with words. "I should have saved him," Jon said to the roots, to the night, to the red faces that had seen boys and men and wolves many times before. "I should have made him swerve, I should have." Ghost pushed his muzzle under Jon's arm and lifted, hard enough to threaten to topple him. Jon's balance went, and he sat in the snow with a gracelessness that would have made Arya bark laughter and kick him and run. That thought hurt more than the rest and less. He pressed his face into Ghost's coat and breathed, and the wolf's smell filled his head with something like home and like a road and like a grave, and none of those things mattered at all. Davos found them later and stood at a distance with his hands folded as if to keep them from meddling with the gods. "If there is grief left tomorrow," he said gently, "you'll have time to spend it. Tonight there are men who need to see you stand." "I'm tired of standing," Jon said. He said it like a joke. It wasn't. Davos said. "But we often do what we're tired of. It is, I'm learning the definition of being alive." He cleared his throat. "There is another matter. One I would have you hear when you are made of more than ice and regret." Jon looked up. Davos's face had changed since morning. There was a new line cut in it, fine and deep as a scribe's stroke. "Say it," Jon said. "In the ruins of a camp I found a stag carved by a child," Davos said. "I found it in ashes too tidy to be a fallen cook fire. The red woman burns, my lord, my friend. She burns children and calls it prayer. Not this day. Not in your hall." Jon listened. There was no surprise in him, not anymore. only the recognition of a duty that had been out in the cold waiting to be let in. "Tomorrow," he said, "when the sun is up and the men are fed." He met Davos's eyes and did not look away. "You shall speak and she shall answer. Whatever comes, it will come by day." Davos bowed his head. "Aye, by day." He took himself away. He had always understood when to leave things alone. Jon slept then, for an hour, for two, sprawled in his cloak against Ghost's warmth, with the heart tree's red leaves sighing above him and the sky showing the first fine threads of stars. He slept without dreams, or with the kind of dreams that lie down and go quiet when a wolf's breath is in your ear. When he woke, it was full dark and the banners in the yard had been changed. The flayed man came down and the dire wolf went up. The wind moved the cloth and made it look like a thing alive. Men cheered softly, as if they were afraid to wake their luck. In the morning the hall filled with the sound of boots and spoons, the clatter of a house shaking the snow from its shoulders and finding itself again. Jon walked among them, not as a lord yet and not as a supplicant, but as a man who had bled with them yesterday and would bleed tomorrow if asked. Men reached to touch his sleeve. They touched Ghost's flank and drew their hands away quick when they felt the living heat under the fur. The Bear Island girls stared openly, one of them biting her lip to hide a fool's smile, and then failing to hide it, and then not caring. Sansa sat at the high end of the table, not on the chair that had been their father's. She would not until the room had decided whether it was hers. She met Jon's gaze and let him see the tiredness and the steady thing under it. He moved to her side and stood and did not make a claim on chair or word. He looked as if he had been built out of the room. Later, in the small council chamber where the table had once held maps like lures and traps, they counted losses and found them as high as honesty demanded. Tormund scratched at the dressing on his shoulder and grunted. "Fewer dead than if we'd faced them without your white beast," he said, jerking his chin at Ghost dozing under the window. "We would have died if not for the riders from the Vale," Sansa said, and did not look at Peter Baelish where he stood in the shadow, all green silk and patient eyes. "We live because we did not fight alone. We live because we fought," Davos said shortly, "and because the gods took a nap and trusted us a while." Baelish smiled his suggestion of a smile. "Winterfell's need has always been the Vale's concern," he said, and made it sound true because that is what he did. Jon let the lie pass. There would be time to set new truths over the old. They did not speak of Ramsay in that room. They did not need to. He had been erased from the yard as completely as a name from parchment under a knife. If they had heard a dog barking in the night, if they had dreamed of a man shouting and then not, if Sansa's mouth was a tight pale line this morning and her eyes both older and younger than they had been yesterday, no one said. There are some kindnesses you give by never naming. In the days that followed, Winterfell breathed as if it had had its chest bound and then the bandage had come off. The snow lay whiter within the walls than without. Fires burned with an energy that was not all wood. Messengers rode under new banners to houses that had remembered and forgotten in equal measure, asking them to remember longer. The weirwood's face watched without changing, as it had watched men throw crowns up and cut them down like apples. Jon trained in the yard as he always had because his hands needed it. Ghost ranged the walls and the woods and the echoing corridors, being himself in every place, a sentinel and a rumor. Sometimes Jon felt the wolf return to him from far away, a smell, a taste, a heat on the foreleg, and the echo of it would touch Jon's throat or tongue as if he had lapped from a stream. He had never warged as some men do, falling behind their own eyes like pebbles dropped into a well. He did not like the abandonment in that. But he had learned the touch, the riding without theft. Ghost tolerated him in the way mountains tolerate wind. One afternoon he took the wolf to the Godswood with a leather roll under his arm. He unrolled it on the grass, which was brown and green under the snow, and took out the harness Tormund had made. He set it on the ground, and Ghost sniffed it as if to approve the repairs Jon had put in. He fastened it on with the practiced ease of a man who intends to make certain kinds of madness routine. He swung up once, twice, 3 times, until his body found the exact place on the wolf's spine where he did not hinder and was not lost. He took Ghost around the pool and between the red roots and under the white face with its bloody eyes. He was thinking of the day when he would do this before men and make them know that Winterfell had not merely a lord but something the Boltons and the Freys and all their like could not name and so could not predict. Sansa came on quiet boots. She watched for a while with an expression that was more calculation than wonder. If there was wonder, she held it for later. "You will frighten them," she said finally, when Ghost came to stand with him aboard at the edge of the pool again. "Good," Jon said, a simple word that fit easily in the cold air. "Some you will rally," Sansa added. "Some you will lose. Choose which you like better." "I want both," he said, and allowed himself, for the first time since Rickon had coughed blood onto new snow, a small half-smile. "The dead will not care how we look when they come." She studied him in a way that made him think of their father considering a point of law or a horse's teeth. Then she nodded. "Ride him before the men. Let them see what you are now. And after, stand on your own 2 feet at supper and listen more than you speak. They will forgive you the first because you do the second." He almost told her she sounded like their mother, though he remembered Catelyn only in fragments at the best of times. The smell of her wool, the absolute in her voice when she spoke of what could not happen. He did not say it. Sansa had become herself, which was better than becoming anyone else. "And you?" he asked. "What will you be?" "Busy," she said dryly. "Counting, measuring, sewing. Ruling, when it's needed and no one thinks to call it that." He laughed then, softly. Felt like pulling a splinter and seeing the skin close over clean. "We'll do it together," he said, and he meant Winterfell, and he meant the North, and he meant the long war that no banners had yet been painted for. That evening he called the men to the yard and did as Sansa had urged. He had Tormund string a rope and hang a weight from it, a sack of pebbles bound in old hide, and he had Ghost run under it and leap as he swung, Jon perched low and tight as a spur. The LF took the bag in his teeth and shook it with the boredom of a dog worrying mutton. The men roared. Then Jon set a line of pikes and had them thrust in time, and he and Ghost wove in and out of that bristled trench like thread through tough cloth, never so much as stirring a spear's point. The men stopped roaring and leaned forward. In their faces he saw fear, yes, but he saw something else too. Relief, maybe, that their side would have at least one secret in the open. After, he dismounted and walked among them, taking hands, absorbing stares. "A lord who will run at a wall of spears on a beast like a tail," a man said somewhere behind him. "Might be this winter won't be so long. Might be it will be longer," another replied. "But we'll have a tale to tell in it." That night, after meat and mead and maps, after dispatches and hard bread, Davos stood before the high table and cleared his throat. The hall quieted toward him the way a sea will draw down from a ship. "There is a thing that needs saying," he said, and he told it like a man telling a court his own theft, steady, with no fancy. Melisandre listened with her usual unmoved flame. When he spoke the name of the girl, something like grief crossed her. So quick Jon might have thought he had imagined it if he hadn't learned to see small things since he'd come back. When Davos had finished, the Red Woman set her hands palm down on the table and said, "I have served my God with fire. I have been wrong. I will serve your war with truth if you command it. If you command my death, I will not run." She looked at the dark beyond the windows. "My God has work in cold places too. He may yet ask me for things that hurt us all." Jon heard the bone in Davos's voice when the older man said, "Death then." And he heard his own when he said, "No, exile." He said it because killing her now felt like spending a coin he might need, because she had pulled him from blackness once and coins like that do not return when you throw them away, because the boy in the yard still lay between them and he could not find it in him to let the fires have another. "Ride south. Do not return. If you do, the sentence is death." Davos looked at him a long while, then nodded as a man nods to a ship that will sail whether he blesses it or not. The Red Woman stood. She gave Jon a look that was both inquiry and farewell and neither. "The dead have many hands," she said. "Ask your wolf to know their scent when they come." Then she went, and the hall breathed again, not easier, but deeper. Days stacked themselves neatly like wood, and then less neatly as wood runs out and you must cut more. Scouts came and went with news of Karstarks taking down their Bolton colors and Umber men skulking toward their halls with the furtiveness of dogs who know their names again. A raven from the wall brought cold words about things moving in the woods beyond, lights in the far distance that were not torches and not stars. The maester tied notes and sent birds through low sky, their wings laboring in thickening air. Jon took patrols into the white world with Ghost under him and beside him and sometimes ahead. The men got used to it the way men get used to anything that does not kill them at once. He learned the wolf's stride enough that he could knock, draw, and loose from Ghost's back at a rope target swinging off a tree limb, and then he learned what he could not do. The sharp cut right with an arrow half drawn, the midair turn that would unseat any man who was not born wolf. He learned to let Ghost be Ghost. That was the deeper lesson. To command without asking the world to stop being itself. One such day, on a long curve of white where the wind had scalloped the drifts into crescent moons, they met a small party trudging toward the castle. They wore the tattered remnants of ground-owed fealty. Some looked like farmers. One carried the tired dignity of a septon with no September. A girl of perhaps 12 walked at their center with a boy in her arms who did not wake, wrapped in a cloak too thin to pretend warmth. When she saw Ghost, she did not start. She only stopped and made the smallest bow. That, more than a shout or a prayer, broke Jon cleanly where he needed breaking. He slid down, spoke soft, and took the boy. The child's breath was shallow. The girl said, "He hasn't been warm since the pink men came. We went into the woods and the trees wanted us to stay. But we want to go home." "You've come home," Jon said, and when he carried the boy into Winterfell, men saw him with the weight in his arms and saw the white wolf pace at his heel, and something righted itself in them like a ship that has taken a wave and steadied. Sansa met them at the great doors and called for water and blankets and honeyed milk with a competence that left no room for pity. The boy woke, a little, and in his eyes something flickered that might one day be laughter. Jon set him down and the girl took his hand, and the world did not fix itself, but it shifted toward its own shape. Winter did not relent. It never does. But Winterfell stood. The hall filled and emptied. Ropes were pulled and gates lifted, and men came and went and learned to look up at the ramparts not with dread but with expectation. The dire wolf on the banners moved in the wind and seemed some days to lean forward. Ghosts wound heeled to a pale seam under fur. In the spring that would not feel like spring, they called the lords to Winterfell to speak of wars that make men seem like boys throwing stones in a dark, older war. They came because they could not afford not to. Jon sat among them, not quite at the chair at the head, not quite away from it, and Sansa sat a pace to his left where she could take the measure of men who had paid too much attention to one chair and never enough to what sits beside it. They spoke of stores and walls, of ravens and rumors, of the blue-eyed dead and the places where the snow still made odd, quiet patterns as if it were remembering footsteps it had covered. When the talking grew thin, Lyanna Mormont, small, fierce, uninterested in anyone's sense of proportions, stood and said in a voice as stern as an ant's, "The North remembers who brought Winterfell back from thieves and butchers." She turned her hard gaze on men who had chosen convenience over courage and men who had pretended not to see. "We remember a Stark riding a wolf into a battle no map wanted. We remember those who did not. We name a king because winter is a time to know who can face it." Jon tried to say he was no king. The words rose and met Ghost's eyes and fell away. Ghost stood at his side with a patience that felt like a tide waiting for the moon. Sansa looked at Jon and then at the men and women around them and then down at her hands. When she looked up, the corners of her mouth softened, and he knew the door she had opened and shut in her mind. She nodded once, barely, that exact amount of assent that would let the room think it had made her do it. The hall's sound rose and took on weight. Swords thumped the table. Voices echoed off stone. The old words came not as if from a play, but as if a room had decided to say them for itself. The sound made flesh and stood up. "King in the North," they chanted, and outside the snow passed through the air like long, quiet veils. Jon felt the title strike his breastbone like a blow and then sink in as if it had been trying to live there all his life. He looked at Sansa. She did not smile. She breathed. It felt like victory, and it felt like surrender, and it felt like a long road with wolves trotting along it, silent, tireless. In the nights after, when the hall burned low and the chores were done and the cold had driven most souls to bed, he would sometimes take Ghost out beyond the walls. He would mount and the wolf would bear him over the field where Rickon had fallen and past the ruined stakes where flayed men had swayed and down to the stream that cut the land like a line on a palm. There he would dismount, and man and beast would drink the same water that had known them since it had known any of their kind. And then they would not ride. They would simply run side by side until the night peeled back and the world was only breath and the sound of paws and boots in snow, and the old gods would mark their passage and remember it, and the newer kind would watch from far and warm places and wonder what had changed. What had changed was simple and not. A boy had died where a boy should not. A man had not. A house had reclaimed its name not with a piece of paper or a kiss of a ring, but with a white shadow crossing a killing field and a redwood tree listening, and the smell of a wolf under winter stars. The Boltons were gone. The banners showed it. The dogs of Winterfell belonged to themselves again and slept by the kitchen fires and begged from boys who had hands to give. In time, as ravens began to bring colder news from colder heights and men learned the trick of sleeping lightly in their mail without bruising themselves into uselessness, the day came when Jon stood at the Winterfell gate and looked north not to find a man to kill but to meet a tide. He put his boot into Ghost's grip and swung up and felt the old rightness settle in his bones. Sansa came to his stirrup and laid a hand on Ghost's shoulder. The wolf turned his head and watched her with the serious courtesy he reserved for those he had decided were pack. She did not kiss her brother goodbye. She tightened the strap at his thigh and checked the grip loops with a quick tug and met his eyes. "Remember not to be a hero," she said, dry and unsmiling. "I have a wolf for that," Jon said, and that almost smile came and went between them. He rode out under the direwolf banner with the north roiling at his back, and Ghost's paws made no sound on the snow. The men behind talked as men do in the face of the unknown, quietly, quickly, about food and old tales and the way birds fly low before weather. The old gods watched from their wood. The new gods, if they cared, were lighting other men's rooms. They went north to meet the dark with a white animal at their fore and a man who had learned, finally, that power is not the same as force and that hope is a blade you keep sheathed and sharp. If an enemy would set boys running and loose arrows into their backs, then the North would answer with something too old to mock and too real to break. A dire wolf with a man on it moves through a world that has been waiting for it since the first snow fell and some stubborn soul stood up. Ghost ran. Jon bent low and listened to the wind. The winter road unrolled ahead like a scar that had been closed and was opening again. He would walk it, ride it, run it, with his sister's counsel in his ear and a wolf's heart under his hand. What men remembered of the Battle of the Bastards would be told in market squares and smoky halls and to children under heavy blankets on creaking beds. The suffocating circle of pikes, the giant roaring like a mountain breaking, the sudden thunder of the Vale, the fall of a wicked house. But in the North, when the old women added salt and truth, they would always end with the same image, the White Guardian carrying a Stark into a sea of spears and out again. And they would nod to themselves by whatever fires remained and say, as if they had always known it, "This is how Winterfell returned to being Winterfell. This is how the North remembered. This is how the living began to turn and face what really hunts." The night gave them a clear path for the moment. The stars were hard. The snow sang a soft song under Ghost's paws. Jon leaned into the wolf's warmth and felt it answer like a drum. Somewhere behind, in a castle stitched together by love and stubbornness, Sansa moved through rooms with a lamp and a ledger and a mind like a loom, weaving bread out of stone and law out of memory. Somewhere ahead, the cold breathed and the dead learned the names of the living. Here, now, there was the line of movement a man and a wolf make together when the world is not watching. It is a small line until it isn't. It is how stories start and how some end, and how the true ones keep going.